My esteemed students, let me delve into one of the cardinal principles of my ethical philosophy: the categorical imperative. In both the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals and the critique of practical reason, I have explored the intricate connection between morality and freedom, a concept often referred to as the reciprocity thesis. This fundamental premise posits that to act morally is tantamount to exercising freedom, and the full exercise of freedom is possible only through moral action. Firstly, we need to comprehend what it means to act out of a will. When we choose to act, we invariably act based on a principle, a maxim as I call it. Maxims are subjective rules that guide our actions. They delineate what we are doing and why we are doing it. For instance, a person may choose to follow the maxim, to increase my wealth by every safe means. We may not always be conscious of our maxims, and they might not always be consistent, but as rational beings, our actions aim at some end or goal expressed in our maxims. These ends might be as straightforward as satisfying a desire, such as drinking coffee, or as complex as becoming a doctor. Importantly, our actions are not purely driven by desires or impulses but rather are choices made based on our maxims. Secondly, I distinguish between two types of principles or rules that guide our actions: material and formal principles. Material principles dictate actions that aim to satisfy some desire. For example, if you have a desire for coffee, you might act on the maxim to go to a cafe, which is a material principle. Corresponding to material principles are what I call hypothetical imperatives. Hypothetical imperatives guide how you should act if you wish to satisfy a particular desire. For instance, the imperative, if you want coffee, then go to the cafe, applies to you if and only if you desire coffee. In contrast, formal principles describe actions without reference to desires. Categorical imperatives, which command actions unconditionally, correspond to formal principles. While hypothetical imperatives apply only if you have a specific goal or desire, categorical imperatives apply unconditionally, regardless of your goals or desires. This unconditional nature is what makes moral laws categorical imperatives. For instance, the moral law to help others in need applies to me regardless of whether I desire to help others or not. Similarly, the duty not to steal does not cease to apply if stealing could satisfy a desire of mine. Moral laws, therefore, apply universally and unconditionally. Thirdly, when we act based only on material principles or hypothetical imperatives, we do not act freely. Such actions aim to satisfy our desires, which are not entirely within our control. However, we are always free in the sense that we can choose to govern ourselves rationally rather than being governed by our desires. Even when we act to satisfy a desire, we choose the maxim for our action, and hence we choose freely. However, our actions are not autonomous if we act only on material principles because we are not setting the law for ourselves, we are letting our desires determine the law of our actions. Finally, the fullest exercise of freedom, or autonomy, is to act based on formal principles or categorical imperatives, that is, to act morally. To check the moral permissibility of a maxim, we can employ the universal law test. Ask whether everyone could act based on that maxim. A maxim is morally permissible only if it could be willed as a universal law. For instance, if I have a maxim to increase my wealth by every safe means and find an unclaimed deposit, I must ask whether this maxim, applied to this situation, could be a universal law, that everyone may claim a deposit which no one can prove has been made. Realizing that such a law would lead to the non-existence of deposits, I understand that my maxim fails the universal law test, making it morally impermissible to act upon. The moral law is, therefore, a law of autonomy, since freedom and unconditional practical law imply each other. Even when our maxims originate from our feelings and desires, if we act only on morally permissible maxims because they are morally permissible, our actions are autonomous. This is the only way to act autonomously, according to my philosophical viewpoint. I hope this exposition clarifies the core tenets of the categorical imperative and its importance in ethical decision-making. If everyone can't do it but you, that isn't a categorical imperative and thus isn't a moral act. When thinking of ethics, one must think beyond oneself, and the universal principle behind the categorical imperative tries to elucidate this. Thank you for your attention and consideration on such an important matter such as ethics and morality.